There are serious barriers to overcome in the struggle for justice, freedom, and dignity, even beyond the bitter class war conducted ceaselessly by the highly class-conscious business world with the indispensable support of the governments they largely control. Where discusses some of these insidious threats as they were understood by working people. He reports the thinking of skilled workers in New York 170 years ago, who repeated the common view that a daily wage is a form of slavery and warned perceptively that a day might come when wage slaves will so far forget what is due to manhood as to glory in a system forced on them by their necessity and in opposition to their feelings of independence and self-respect. They hoped that that day would be far distant. Today, signs of it are common, but demands for independence, self-respect, personal dignity, and control of one's own work and life, like Marx's old mole, continue to burrow not far from the surface, ready to reappear when awakened by circumstances and militant activism. 13. Whose security? How Washington protects itself and the corporate sector. The question of how foreign policy is determined is a crucial one in world affairs. In these comments, I can only provide a few hints as to how I think the subject can be productively explored, keeping to the United States for several reasons. First, the United States is unmatched in its global significance and impact. Second, it is an unusually open society, possibly uniquely so, which means we know more about it. Finally, it is plainly the most important case for Americans, who are able to influence policy choices in the United States, and indeed for others, insofar as their actions can influence such choices. The general principles, however, extend to the other major powers and well beyond. There is a received standard version, common to academic scholarship, government pronouncements, and public discourse. It holds that the prime commitment of governments is to ensure security, and that the primary concern of the United States and its allies from 1945 was the Russian threat. There are a number of ways to evaluate this doctrine. One obvious question to ask is, what happened when the Russian threat disappeared in 1989? The answer: everything continued much as before. The United States immediately invaded Panama, killing possibly thousands of people and installing a client regime. This was routine practice in U.S.-dominated domains, but in this case not quite as routine. For the first time, a major foreign policy act was not justified by an alleged Russian threat. Instead, a series of fraudulent pretexts for the invasion were concocted that collapse instantly on examination. The media chimed in enthusiastically, lauding the magnificent achievement of defeating Panama, unconcerned that the pretexts were ludicrous, that the act itself was a radical violation of international law, and that it was bitterly condemned elsewhere, most harshly in Latin America. Also ignored was the U.S. veto of a unanimous Security Council resolution condemning crimes by U.S. troops during the invasion, with Britain alone abstaining. All routine. And all forgotten, which is also routine. From El Salvador to the Russian border. The administration of George H.W. Bush issued a new national security policy and defense budget in reaction to the collapse of the global enemy. It was pretty much the same as before, although with new pretexts. It was, it turned out, necessary to maintain a military establishment almost as great as the rest of the world combined, and far more advanced in technological sophistication, but not for defense against the disappearing Soviet Union. Rather, the excuse was the growing, technological sophistication of Third World powers. Disciplined intellectuals understood that it would have been improper to collapse in ridicule, so they maintained a proper silence. The United States, the new policy insisted, must maintain its defense industrial base. The phrase is a euphemism, referring to high-tech industry generally, which relies heavily on extensive state intervention for research and development, often under Pentagon cover, in what many economists continue to call the U.S. free market economy. One of the most interesting provisions of the new plans had to do with the Middle East. There, it was declared, Washington must maintain intervention forces targeting a crucial region where the major problems could not have been laid at the Kremlin's door. Contrary to 50 years of deceit, it was quietly conceded that the main concern in this region was not the Russians, but rather what is called radical nationalism, meaning independent nationalism not under U.S. control. All of this has evident bearing on the received standard version, but it passed unnoticed, or, perhaps, therefore it passed unnoticed. Other important events took place immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall, ending the Cold War. One was in El Salvador, the leading recipient of U.S. military aid, apart from Israel and Egypt, a separate category, and with one of the worst human rights records anywhere. That is a familiar and very close correlation. The Salvadoran High Command ordered the Atlacatl Battalion to invade the Jesuit University and murder 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, all Jesuit priests, including the rector, Father Ignacio Ellacuria, and any witnesses, meaning their housekeeper and her daughter. The battalion had already left a bloody trail of thousands of the usual victims in the course of the U.S.-run state terror campaign in El Salvador, part of a broader terror and torture campaign throughout the region. All routine, ignored and virtually forgotten in the United States and by its allies, again routine. But it tells us a lot about the factors that drive policy, if we care to look at the real world. Another important event took place in Europe. Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev agreed to allow the reunification of Germany and its membership in NATO, a hostile military alliance. In light of recent history, this was a most astonishing concession. There was a quid pro quo. President Bush and Secretary of State James Baker agreed that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east, meaning into East Germany. Instantly, they expanded NATO to East Germany. Gorbachev was naturally outraged, but when he complained, he was instructed by Washington that this had only been a verbal promise, a gentleman's agreement, hence without force. If he was naive enough to accept the word of American leaders, it was his problem. All of this, too, was routine, as was the silent acceptance and approval of the expansion of NATO in the United States and the West generally. President Bill Clinton then expanded NATO right up to Russia's borders. Today, the world faces a serious crisis that is in no small measure a result of these policies. The appeal of plundering the poor. Another source of evidence is the declassified historical record. It contains revealing accounts of the actual motives of state policy. The story is rich and complex, but a few persistent themes play a dominant role. One was articulated clearly at a Western Hemispheric conference called by the United States in Mexico, in February 1945, where Washington imposed an economic charter of the Americas, designed to eliminate economic nationalism in all its forms. There was one unspoken exception: economic nationalism would be fine for the United States, whose economy relies heavily on massive state intervention. The elimination of economic nationalism for others stood in sharp conflict with the Latin American stand of that moment, which State Department officials described as the philosophy of the new nationalism, that embraces policies designed to bring about a broader distribution of wealth and to raise the standard of living of the masses. As U.S. policy analysts added, Latin Americans are convinced that the first beneficiaries of the development of a country's resources should be the people of that country. That, of course, will not do. Washington understands that the first beneficiaries should be U.S. investors, while Latin America fulfills its service function. It should not, as both the Truman and Eisenhower administrations would make clear, undergo excessive industrial development that might infringe on U.S. interests. Thus Brazil could produce low-quality steel that U.S. corporations did not want to bother with, but it would be excessive were it to compete with U.S. firms. Similar concerns resonate throughout the post-World War II period. The global system that was to be dominated by the United States was threatened by what internal documents call radical and nationalistic regimes that responded to popular pressures for independent development. That was the concern that motivated the overthrow of the parliamentary governments of Iran and Guatemala in 1953 and 1954, as well as numerous others. In the case of Iran, a major concern was the potential impact of Iranian independence on Egypt, then in turmoil over British colonial practices. In Guatemala, apart from the crime of the new democracy in empowering the peasant majority and infringing on possessions of the United Fruit Company, already offensive enough, Washington's concern was labor unrest and popular mobilization in neighboring U.S.-backed dictatorships. In both cases the consequences reach to the present. Literally not a day has passed since 1953 when the United States has not been torturing the people of Iran. Guatemala remains one of the world's worst horror chambers. To this day, Mayans are fleeing from the effects of near-genocidal government military campaigns in the highlands backed by President Ronald Reagan and his top officials. As the country director of Oxfam, a Guatemalan doctor, reported in 2014, there is a dramatic deterioration of the political, social, and economic context. Attacks against human rights defenders have increased 300% during the last year. There is a clear evidence of a very well-organized strategy by the private sector and army. Both have captured the government in order to keep the status quo and to impose the extraction economical model, pushing away dramatically indigenous peoples from their own land, due to the mining industry, African palm and sugar cane plantations. In addition, the social movement defending their land and rights has been criminalized. Many leaders are in jail and many others have been killed. Nothing is known about this in the United States, and the very obvious cause of it remains suppressed. In the 1950s, President Eisenhower and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles explained quite clearly the dilemma that the United States faced. They complained that the communists had an unfair advantage. They were able to appeal directly to the masses and get control of mass movements, something we have no capacity to duplicate. The poor people are the ones they appeal to, and they have always wanted to plunder the rich. That causes problems. The United States somehow finds it difficult to appeal to the poor with its doctrine that the rich should plunder the poor. The Cuban example. A clear illustration of the general pattern was Cuba, when it finally gained independence in 1959. Within months, military attacks on the island began. Shortly after, the Eisenhower administration made a secret decision to overthrow the government. John F. Kennedy then became president. He intended to devote more attention to Latin America, and so, on taking office, he created a study group to develop policies that was headed by the historian Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr., who summarized its conclusions for the incoming president. As Schlesinger explained, what was threatening in an independent Cuba was The Castro idea of taking matters into one's own hands. It was an idea that unfortunately appealed to the mass of the population in Latin America, where the distribution of land and other forms of national wealth greatly favors the propertied classes, and the poor and underprivileged, stimulated by the example of the Cuban Revolution, are now demanding opportunities for a decent living. Again, Washington's usual dilemma. As the CIA explained, the extensive influence of Castroism is not a function of Cuban power. Castro's shadow looms large because social and economic conditions throughout Latin America invite opposition to ruling authority, and encourage agitation for radical change, for which his Cuba provided a model. Kennedy feared that Russian aid might make Cuba a showcase for development, giving the Soviets the upper hand throughout Latin America. The State Department policy planning staff warned that the primary danger we face in Castro is in the impact the very existence of his regime has upon the leftist movement in many Latin American countries. The simple fact is that Castro represents a successful defiance of the United States, a negation of our whole hemispheric policy of almost a century and a half, that is, since the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, when the United States declared its intention of dominating the hemisphere. The immediate goal at the time of the doctrine was to conquer Cuba, but that could not be achieved because of the power of the British enemy. Still, that grand strategist John Quincy Adams, the intellectual father of the Monroe Doctrine and Manifest Destiny, informed his colleagues that over time Cuba would fall into our hands by the laws of political gravitation, as an apple falls from the tree. In brief, U.S. power would increase and Britain's would decline. In 1898, Adams's prognosis was realized. The United States invaded Cuba in the guise of liberating it. In fact, it prevented the island's liberation from Spain and turned it into a virtual colony, to quote historians Ernest May and Philip Zelikow. Cuba remained a virtual U.S. colony until January 1959, when it gained independence. Since that time it has been subjected to major U.S. terrorist wars, primarily during the Kennedy years, and economic strangulation. And not because of the Russians. The pretense all along was that we were defending ourselves from the Russian threat, an absurd explanation that generally went unchallenged. A simple test of the thesis, again, is what happened when any conceivable Russian threat disappeared. U.S. policy toward Cuba became even harsher, spearheaded by liberal Democrats, including Bill Clinton, who outflanked Bush from the right in the 1992 election. On the face of it, these events should have considerable bearing on the validity of the doctrinal framework for discussion of foreign policy and the factors that drive it. Once again, however, the impact is slight. The virus of nationalism. Henry Kissinger caught the essence of the real foreign policy of the United States when he termed independent nationalism a virus that might spread contagion. Kissinger was referring to Salvador Allende's Chile. The virus was the idea that there might be a parliamentary path towards some kind of socialist democracy. The way to deal with such a threat was to destroy the virus and inoculate those who might be infected, typically by imposing murderous national security states. That was achieved in the case of Chile, but it is important to recognize that the thinking held, and still holds, worldwide. It was, for example, the reasoning behind the decision to oppose Vietnamese nationalism in the early 1950s and support France's effort to reconquer its former colony. It was feared that independent Vietnamese nationalism might be a virus that would spread contagion to the surrounding regions, including resource-rich Indonesia. That might even have led Japan to become the industrial and commercial center of an independent new order of the kind Imperial Japan had so recently fought to establish. The remedy was clear, and largely achieved. Vietnam was virtually destroyed and ringed by military dictatorships that kept the virus from spreading contagion. The same was true in Latin America in the same years. One virus after another was viciously attacked and either destroyed or weakened to the point of bare survival. From the early 1960s, a plague of repression was imposed on the continent that had no precedent in the violent history of the hemisphere, extending to Central America in the 1980s, a matter that there should be no need to review. Much the same was true in the Middle East. The unique U.S. relations with Israel were established, in their current form in 1967 when Israel delivered a smashing blow to Egypt, the center of secular Arab nationalism. By doing so, it protected U.S. ally Saudi Arabia, then engaged in military conflict with Egypt in Yemen. Saudi Arabia, of course, is the most extreme radical fundamentalist Islamic state, and also a missionary state, expending huge sums to establish its Wahhabi Salafi doctrines beyond its borders. It is worth remembering that the United States, like England before it, has tended to support radical fundamentalist Islam in opposition to secular nationalism, which has until recently been perceived as posing more of a threat of independence and contagion. The value of secrecy. There is much more to say, but the historical record demonstrates very clearly that the Standard Doctrine has little merit. Security in the normal sense is not a prominent factor in policy formation. To repeat, in the normal sense. But in evaluating the Standard Doctrine we have to ask what is actually meant by a security. Security for whom? One answer is, security for state power. There are many illustrations. In May 2014, for example, the United States agreed to support a UN Security Council resolution calling on the International Criminal Court to investigate war crimes in Syria, but with a proviso: there could be no inquiry into possible war crimes by Israel or by Washington, though it was unnecessary to add that last condition. The United States is uniquely self-immunized from the international legal system. In fact, there is even congressional legislation authorizing the president to use armed force to rescue any American brought to The Hague for trial, the Netherlands Invasion Act, as it is sometimes called in Europe. That once again illustrates the importance of protecting the security of state power. But protecting it from whom? There is, in fact, a strong case to be made that a prime concern of government is the security of state power from the population. As those who have spent time rummaging through archives should be aware, government secrecy is rarely motivated by a genuine need for security, but it definitely does serve to keep the population in the dark. And for good reasons, which were lucidly explained by prominent liberal scholar and government advisor Samuel Huntington. In his words, the architects of power in the United States must create a force that can be felt but not seen. Power remains strong when it remains in the dark. Exposed to the sunlight it begins to evaporate. Huntington wrote that in 1981, when the Cold War was again heating up, and he explained further that you may have to sell intervention or other military action in such a way as to create the misimpression that it is the Soviet Union that you are fighting. That is what the United States has been doing ever since the Truman Doctrine. These simple truths are rarely acknowledged, but they provide insight into state power and policy, with reverberations to the present moment. State power has to be protected from its domestic enemy. In sharp contrast, the population is not secure from state power. A striking illustration is the radical attack on the Constitution by the Obama administration's massive surveillance program. It is, of course, justified by national security. That is routine for virtually all actions of all states and so carries little information. When the NSA's surveillance program was exposed by Edward Snowden's revelations, high officials claimed that it had prevented 54 terrorist acts. On inquiry, that was whittled down to a dozen. A high-level government panel then discovered that there was actually only one case. Someone had sent $8,500 to Somalia. That was the total yield of the huge assault on the Constitution and, of course, on others throughout the world. Britain's attitude is interesting. In 2007, the British government called on Washington's colossal spy agency to analyze and retain any British citizens. Mobile phone and fax numbers, emails, and IP addresses swept up by its dragnet, The Guardian reported. That is a useful indication of the relative significance, in government eyes, of the privacy of its own citizens and of Washington's demands. Another concern is security for private power. One illustration is the huge trade agreements, the Trans-Pacific and Transatlantic Pacts, now being negotiated. These are being negotiated in secret, but not completely in secret. They are not secret from the hundreds of corporate lawyers who are drawing up the detailed provisions. It is not hard to guess what the results will be, and the few leaks about them suggest that the expectations are accurate. Like NAFTA and other such pacts, these are not free trade agreements. In fact, they are not even trade agreements, but primarily investor rights agreements. Again, secrecy is critically important to protect the primary domestic constituency of the governments involved, the corporate sector. The final century of human civilization? There are other examples too numerous to mention, facts that are well established and would be taught in elementary schools in free societies. There is, in other words, ample evidence that securing state power from the domestic population and securing concentrated private power are driving forces in policy formation. Of course, it is not quite that simple. There are interesting cases, some quite current, where these commitments conflict, but we can consider this to be a good first approximation, and one radically opposed to the received standard doctrine. Let us turn to another question: what about the security of the population? It is easy to demonstrate that this is of marginal concern to policy planners. Take two prominent current examples: global warming and nuclear weapons. As any literate person is doubtless aware, these are dire threats to the security of the population. Turning to state policy, we find that it is committed to accelerating each of those threats, in the interests of its primary concerns, protection of state power and of the concentrated private power that largely determines state policy. Consider global warming. There is now much exuberance in the United States about 100 years of energy independence, as we become the Saudi Arabia of the next century. Perhaps the final century of human civilization if current policies persist. That illustrates very clearly the nature of the concern for security, certainly not for the population. It also illustrates the moral calculus of contemporary state capitalism. The fate of our grandchildren counts as nothing when compared with the imperative of higher profits tomorrow. These conclusions are fortified by a closer look at the propaganda system. There is a huge public relations campaign in the United States, organized quite openly by big energy and the business world, to try to convince the public that global warming is either unreal or not a result of human activity. And it has had some impact. The United States ranks lower than other countries in public concern about global warming, and the results are stratified. Among Republicans, the party more fully dedicated to the interests of wealth and corporate power, it ranks far lower than the global norm. The premier journal of media criticism, the Columbia Journalism Review, had an interesting article on the subject attributing this outcome to the media doctrine of fair and balanced. In other words, if a journal publishes an opinion piece reflecting the conclusions of 97% of scientists, it must also run a counterpiece expressing the viewpoint of the energy corporations. That indeed is what happens, but there certainly is no fair and balanced doctrine. Thus, if a journal runs an opinion piece denouncing Russian President Vladimir Putin for the criminal act of taking over the Crimea, it surely does not have to run a piece pointing out that, while the act is indeed criminal, Russia has a far stronger case today than the United States did more than a century ago in taking over southeastern Cuba, including Guantanamo, the country's major port, and rejecting the Cuban demand since independence to have it returned. And the same is true of many other cases. The actual media doctrine is fair and balanced when the concerns of concentrated private power are involved, but surely not elsewhere. On the issue of nuclear weapons, the record is similarly interesting and frightening. It reveals very clearly that, from the earliest days, the security of the population was a non-issue, and remains so. There is no need here to run through the shocking record, but there is little doubt that policymakers have been playing roulette with the fate of the species. As we are all surely aware, we now face the most ominous decisions in human history. There are many problems that must be addressed, but two are overwhelming in their significance: environmental destruction and nuclear war. For the first time in history, we face the possibility of destroying the prospects for decent existence, and not in the distant future. For this reason alone, it is imperative to sweep away the ideological clouds and face honestly and realistically the question of how policy decisions are made, and what we can do to alter them before it is too late. 14. Outrage. Almost every day brings news of awful crimes, but some are so heinous, so horrendous and malicious, that they dwarf all else. One of those rare events took place when Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 was shot down in eastern Ukraine, killing 298 people. The guardian of virtue in the White House denounced it as an outrage of unspeakable proportions, which he attributed to Russian support. His UN ambassador thundered that, when 298 civilians are killed in the horrific downing of a civilian plane, we must stop at nothing to determine who is responsible and to bring them to justice. She also called on Vladimir Putin to end his shameful efforts to evade his very clear responsibility. True, the irritating little man, with the rat-like face, as Timothy Garton Ash described him, had called for an independent investigation, but that could only have been because of sanctions from the one country courageous enough to impose them, the United States, while Europeans cowered in fear. On CNN, former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine William Taylor assured the world that the irritating little man is clearly responsible for the shoot-down of this airliner. For weeks, lead stories reported on the anguish of the families, the lives of the murdered victims, the international efforts to claim the bodies, and the fury over the horrific crime that has stunned the world, as the press reported daily in grisly detail. Every literate person, and certainly every editor and commentator, should instantly have recalled another case when a plane was shot down with comparable loss of life, Iran Air Flight 655, with 290 killed, including 66 children, shot down in Iranian airspace on a clearly identified commercial air route. The agent of this act has always been known. It was the guided missile cruiser USS Vincennes, operating in Iranian waters in the Persian Gulf. The commander of a nearby U.S. vessel, David Carlson, wrote in the U.S. Naval Institute's magazine, Proceedings, that he wondered aloud in disbelief as the Vincennes announced her intentions to attack what was clearly a civilian aircraft. He speculated that robo-cruiser, as the Vincennes was called because of its aggressive behavior, felt a need to prove the viability of Aegis, the sophisticated anti-aircraft system on the cruiser, in the Persian Gulf, and that they hankered for the opportunity to show their stuff. 2 years later, the commander of the Vincennes and the officer in charge of anti-air warfare were given the U.S. Legion of Merit Award for exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding service, and for the calm and professional atmosphere maintained during the period around the downing of the Iranian Airbus. The airplane's destruction itself was not mentioned in the award. President Ronald Reagan blamed the Iranians for the disaster and defended the actions of the warship, which followed standing orders and widely publicized procedures, firing to protect itself against possible attack. His successor, George H. W. Bush, proclaimed that I will never apologize for the United States. I don't care what the facts are. I'm not an apologize for America kind of guy. No evasions of responsibility here, unlike the barbarians in the East. There was little reaction at the time, no outrage, no desperate search for victims, no passionate denunciations of those responsible, no eloquent laments by the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations about the immense and heart-wrenching loss when the airliner was downed. Iranian condemnations were occasionally noted, but dismissed as boilerplate attacks on the United States, as Philip Sheehan of the New York Times put it. Small wonder, then, that this insignificant earlier event merited only a few scattered words in the U.S. media during the vast furor over a real crime, in which the demonic enemy might have been indirectly involved. One exception was the London Daily Mail, where Dominic Lawson wrote that although Putin's apologists might bring up the Iran air attack, the comparison actually demonstrates our high moral values as contrasted with those of the miserable Russians, who try to evade their responsibility for MH17 with lies while Washington at once announced that the U.S. warship had shot down the Iranian aircraft, righteously. What more powerful evidence could there be of our nobility and their depravity? We know why Ukrainians and Russians are in their own countries, but one might ask what exactly the Vincennes was doing in Iranian waters. The answer is simple. It was defending Washington's great friend Saddam Hussein in his murderous aggression against Iran. For the victims, the shootdown was no small matter. It was a major factor in Iran's recognition that it could not fight on any longer, according to historian Dilip Hero. It is worth remembering the extent of Washington's devotion to its friend Saddam. Reagan removed him from the State Department's terrorist list so that aid could be sent to expedite his assault on Iran, and later both denied his terrible crimes against the Kurds, including the use of chemical weapons, and blocked congressional condemnations of those crimes. He also accorded Saddam a privilege otherwise granted only to Israel. There was no serious reaction when Iraq attacked the USS Stark with Exocet missiles, killing 37 crewmen, much like the case of the USS Liberty, attacked repeatedly by Israeli jets and torpedo ships in 1967, killing 34 crewmen. Reagan's successor, George H. W. Bush, went on to provide further aid to Saddam, badly needed after the war with Iran that he had launched. Bush also invited Iraqi nuclear engineers to come to the United States for advanced training in weapons production. In April 1990, he dispatched a high-level Senate delegation, led by future Republican presidential candidate Bob Dole, to convey his warm regards to his friend Saddam and to assure him that he should disregard irresponsible criticism from the haughty and pampered press, and that such miscreants had been removed from Voice of America. The fawning before Saddam continued until he suddenly turned into a new Hitler a few months later when he disobeyed orders, or perhaps misunderstood them, and invaded Kuwait, with illuminating consequences that I must leave aside here. Other precedents for MH17 had long since been sent down the memory hole as being without significance. Take, for instance, the Libyan civilian airliner that was lost in a sandstorm in 1973 and shot down by US-supplied Israeli jets, 2 minutes flight time from Cairo, toward which it was heading. The death toll was only 110 that time. Israel blamed the French pilot of the Libyan plane, with the endorsement of the New York Times, which added that the Israeli act was, at worst, an act of callousness that not even the savagery of previous Arab actions can excuse. The incident was passed over quickly in the United States, with little criticism. When Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir arrived in Washington 4 days later, she faced few embarrassing questions and returned home with new gifts of military aircraft. The reaction was much the same when Washington's favored Angolan terrorist organization, UNITA, claimed to have shot down 2 civilian airliners. Returning to the sole authentic and truly horrific crime, the New York Times reported that UN Ambassador Samantha Power choked up as she spoke of infants who perished in the Malaysia Airlines crash in Ukraine, and the Dutch Foreign Minister, Frans Timmermans, could barely contain his anger as he recalled seeing pictures of thugs snatching wedding bands off the fingers of the victims. At the same session, the report continues, there was also a long recitation of names and ages, all belonging to children killed in the latest Israeli offensive in Gaza. The only reported reaction was by Palestinian envoy Riyad Mansour, who grew quiet in the middle of the recitation. The Israeli attack on Gaza in July did, however, elicit outrage in Washington. President Obama reiterated his strong condemnation of rocket and tunnel attacks against Israel by the militant group Hamas, The Hill reported. He also expressed growing concern about the rising number of Palestinian civilian deaths in Gaza, but without condemnation. The Senate filled that gap, voting unanimously to support Israeli actions in Gaza while condemning the unprovoked rocket fire at Israel by Hamas and calling on Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas to dissolve the unity governing arrangement with Hamas and condemn the attacks on Israel. As for Congress, perhaps it's enough to join the 80% of the public who disapprove of their performance, though the word disapprove is rather too mild in this case. But in Obama's defense, it may be that he has no idea what Israel is doing in Gaza with the weapons that he is kind enough to supply to them. After all, he relies on U.S. intelligence, which may be too busy collecting phone calls and email messages of citizens to pay much attention to such marginalia. It may be useful, then, to review what we all should know. Israel's goal had long been a simple one, quiet for quiet, a return to the norm, though now it may demand even more. What then was the norm? For the West Bank, the norm has been that Israel carries forward its illegal construction of settlements and infrastructure, so that whatever might be of value can be integrated into Israel, while the Palestinians are consigned to unviable cantons and subjected to intense repression and violence. For the past 14 years, the norm has been that Israel kills more than 2 Palestinian children a week. One such recent Israeli rampage was set off on June 12, 2014, by the brutal murder of 3 Israeli boys from a settler community in the occupied West Bank. A month before, 2 Palestinian boys had been shot dead in the West Bank city of Ramallah. That elicited no attention, which is understandable, since it is routine. The institutionalized disregard for Palestinian life in the West helps explain not only why Palestinians resort to violence, the respected Middle East analyst Muin Rabbani reports, but also Israel's latest assault on the Gaza Strip. Its quiet-for-quiet policy has also enabled Israel to carry forward its program of separating Gaza from the West Bank. That program has been pursued vigorously, always with U.S. support, ever since the United States and Israel accepted the Oslo Accords, which declare the two regions to be an inseparable territorial unity. A look at the map explains the rationale. Gaza provides Palestine's only access to the outside world, so once the two are separated, any autonomy that Israel might grant to Palestinians in the West Bank would leave them effectively imprisoned between hostile states, Israel and Jordan. The imprisonment will become even more severe as Israel continues its systematic program of expelling Palestinians from the Jordan Valley and constructing Israeli settlements there. The norm in Gaza was described in detail by the heroic Norwegian trauma surgeon Mads Gilbert, who has worked in Gaza's main hospital through Israel's most grotesque crimes and returned again for the current onslaught. In June 2014, immediately before it began, he submitted a report on the Gaza health sector to UNRWA, the UN agency that tries desperately, on a shoestring, to care for refugees. At least 57% of Gaza households are food insecure and about 80% are now aid recipients, Gilbert reported. Food insecurity and rising poverty also mean that most residents cannot meet their daily caloric requirements, while over 90% of the water in Gaza has been deemed unfit for human consumption, a situation that became even worse when Israel again attacked water and sewage systems, leaving over 1 million people with even more severe disruptions of the barest necessities of life. Gilbert further reported that Palestinian children in Gaza are suffering immensely. A large proportion are affected by the man-made malnourishment regime caused by the Israeli-imposed blockage. Prevalence of anemia in children less than 2 years in Gaza is at 72.8%, while prevalence of wasting, stunting, underweight have been documented at 34.3%, 31.4%, 31.45% respectively. And it gets worse as the report proceeds. The distinguished human rights lawyer Raji Sawarani, who has remained in Gaza through years of Israeli brutality and terror, reports that the most common sentence I heard when people began to talk about ceasefire, "Everybody says it's better for all of us to die and not go back to the situation we used to have before this war. We don't want that again. We have no dignity, no pride, we are just soft targets, and we are very cheap. Either this situation really improves or it is better to just die." I am talking about intellectuals, academics, ordinary people, everybody is saying that. For Gaza, the plans for the norm were explained forthrightly by Dov Weissglass, a confidant of Ariel Sharon and the person who negotiated the withdrawal of Israeli settlers from Gaza in 2005. Hailed as a grand gesture in Israel and among acolytes, the withdrawal was in reality a carefully staged, national trauma, ridiculed by informed Israeli commentators, among them the country's leading sociologist, the late Baruch Kimmerling. What actually happened is that Israeli hawks, led by Sharon, realized that it made good sense to transfer the illegal settlers from their subsidized communities in devastated Gaza, where they were sustained at exorbitant cost, to subsidized settlements in the other occupied territories, which Israel intends to keep. Instead of simply transferring them, as would have been simple enough, It was clearly more useful to present the world with images of little children pleading with soldiers not to destroy their homes, amid cries of "never again," with the implication obvious. What made the farce even more transparent was that it was a replica of the staged trauma, when Israel had to evacuate the Egyptian part of the Sinai Peninsula in 1982. But it played very well for the intended audience at home and abroad. Weissglass provided his own description of the transfer of settlers from Gaza to other occupied territories. What I effectively agreed to with the Americans was that the major settlement blocks in the West Bank would not be dealt with at all, and the rest will not be dealt with until the Palestinians turn into Finns, but a special kind of Finns, who would quietly accept rule by a foreign power. The significance is the freezing of the political process, Weissglass continued. And when you freeze that process, you prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state, and you prevent a discussion about the refugees, the borders, and Jerusalem. Effectively, this whole package that is called the Palestinian state, with all that it entails, has been removed from our agenda indefinitely. And all this with President Bush's authority and permission and the ratification of both houses of Congress. Weissglass explained that Gazans would remain on a diet, but not to make them die of hunger, which would not help Israel's fading reputation. With their vaunted technical efficiency, Israeli experts determined precisely how many calories a day Gazans needed for bare survival, while also depriving them of medicines and other means of a decent life. Israeli military forces confined them by land, sea, and air to what British Prime Minister David Cameron accurately described as a prison camp. The Israeli withdrawal left them in total control of Gaza, hence the occupying power under international law. And to close the prison walls even more tightly, Israel excluded Palestinians from a large region along the border, including a third or more of Gaza's scarce arable land. The justification was security for Israelis, which could have been just as well achieved by establishing the security zone on the Israeli side of the border, or by ending the savage siege and other punishments. The official story is that after Israel graciously handed Gaza over to the Palestinians in the hope that they would construct a flourishing state, they revealed their true nature by subjecting Israel to unremitting rocket attacks and forcing the captive population to become martyrs, so that Israel would be pictured in a bad light. Reality is rather different. A few weeks after Israeli troops withdrew, leaving the occupation intact, Palestinians committed a major crime. In January 2006, they voted the wrong way in a carefully monitored free election, handing control of their parliament to Hamas. The Israeli media constantly intoned that Hamas was dedicated to the destruction of the country. In reality, Hamas's leaders have repeatedly made it clear that they would accept a two-state settlement in accord with the international consensus that has been blocked by the United States and Israel for 40 years. In contrast, Israel is dedicated to the destruction of Palestine, apart from some occasional meaningless words, and is implementing that commitment. True, Israel accepted the roadmap for reaching a two-state settlement initiated by President Bush and adopted by the quartet that was supposed to supervise it, the United States, the European Union, the United Nations, and Russia. But as he accepted the roadmap, Prime Minister Sharon at once added 14 reservations that effectively nullified it. The facts were known to activists, but only revealed to the general public for the first time in Jimmy Carter's book Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid. They remain under wraps in media reporting and commentary. The unrevised 1999 platform of Israel's governing party, Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud, flatly rejects the establishment of a Palestinian Arab state west of the Jordan River. And for those who like to obsess about meaningless charters, the core component of Likud, Menachem Begin's Haret Party, has yet to abandon its founding doctrine that the territory on both sides of the Jordan is part of the land of Israel. The crime of the Palestinians in January 2006 was punished at once. The United States and Israel, with Europe shamefully trailing behind, imposed harsh sanctions on the errant population, and Israel stepped up its violence. By June, when the attacks sharply escalated, Israel had already fired more than 7,700 shells at northern Gaza. The United States and Israel quickly initiated plans for a military coup to overthrow the elected government. When Hamas had the effrontery to foil these plans, the Israeli assaults and the siege became far more severe, justified by the claim that Hamas had taken over the Gaza Strip by force. There should be no need to review again the horrendous record since. The relentless siege and savage attacks have been punctuated by episodes of mowing the lawn, to borrow Israel's cheery expression for its periodic exercises of shooting fish in a pond in what it calls a war of defense. Once the lawn is mowed and the desperate population seeks to reconstruct somehow from the devastation and the murders, there is a ceasefire agreement. These have been regularly observed by Hamas, as Israel concedes, until Israel violates them with renewed violence. The most recent ceasefire was established after Israel's October 2012 assault. Though Israel maintained its devastating siege, Hamas observed the ceasefire, as Israeli officials concede. Matters changed in June, when Fatah and Hamas forged a unity agreement, which established a new government of technocrats that had no Hamas participation and accepted all of the demands of the quartet. Israel was naturally furious, all the more so when even the Obama administration joined in signaling its approval. The unity agreement not only undercut Israel's claim that it cannot negotiate with a divided Palestine, but also threatened the long-term goal of dividing Gaza from the West Bank and pursuing its destructive policies in both regions. Something had to be done, and an occasion arose shortly after, when the 3 Israeli boys were murdered in the West Bank. The Netanyahu government had strong evidence at once that they were dead, but pretended otherwise, which provided the opportunity to launch a rampage in the West Bank, targeting Hamas, undermining the feared unity government, and sharply increasing Israeli repression. Netanyahu claimed to have certain knowledge that Hamas was responsible. That too was a lie, as was recognized early on. There has been no pretense of presenting evidence. One of Israel's leading authorities on Hamas, Shlomi Eldar, reported almost at once that the killers very likely came from a dissident clan in Hebron, that has long been a thorn in the side of Hamas. Eldar added, "I'm sure they didn't get any green light from the leadership of Hamas, they just thought it was the right time to act." The 18-day rampage did succeed in undermining the feared unity government and sharply increasing Israeli repression. According to Israeli military sources, Israeli soldiers arrested 419 Palestinians, including 335 affiliated with Hamas, and killed 6, while searching thousands of locations and confiscating $350,000. Israel also conducted dozens of attacks in Gaza, killing 5 Hamas members on July 7. Hamas finally reacted with its first rockets in 19 months, Israeli officials reported, providing the pretext for Operation Protective Edge on July 8. There has been ample reporting on the exploits of the self-declared most moral army in the world, which, according to Israel's ambassador to the United States, should receive the Nobel Peace Prize. By the end of July, some 1,500 Palestinians had been killed, exceeding the toll of the Operation Cast Lead crimes of 2008-9. 70% of them were civilians, including hundreds of women and children. 3 civilians in Israel were also killed. Large areas of Gaza were turned into rubble. During brief pauses in the bombing, relatives desperately sought shattered bodies or household items in the ruins of homes. Gaza's main power plant was attacked, not for the first time. This is an Israeli specialty, sharply curtailing the already limited electricity and, worse yet, reducing still further the minimal availability of fresh water, another war crime. Meanwhile, rescue teams and ambulances were repeatedly attacked. As atrocities mounted throughout Gaza, Israel claimed that its goal was to destroy tunnels at the border. 4 hospitals were attacked, each yet another war crime. The first was the Al-Wafa Rehabilitation Hospital in Gaza City, attacked on the day Israeli ground forces invaded the prison. A few lines in the New York Times, within a story about the ground invasion, reported that most but not all of the 17 patients and 25 doctors and nurses were evacuated before the electricity was cut and heavy bombardments nearly destroyed the building, doctors said. "We evacuated them under fire," said Dr. Ali Abu Riala, a hospital spokesman. Nurses and doctors had to carry the patients on their backs, some of them falling off the stairway. There is an unprecedented state of panic in the hospital. 3 working hospitals were then attacked, while patients and staff were left to their own devices to survive. One Israeli crime did receive wide condemnation: the attack on a UN school that was harboring 3,300 terrified refugees who had fled the ruins of their neighborhoods, on the orders of the Israeli army. The outraged UNRWA Commissioner General, Pierre Krahenbuhl, said, "I condemn in the strongest possible terms this serious violation of international law by Israeli forces. Today the world stands disgraced." There were at least 3 Israeli strikes at the refugee shelter, a site well known to the Israeli army. The precise location of the Jabalia Elementary Girls' School and the fact that it was housing thousands of internally displaced people was communicated to the Israeli army 17 times, to ensure its protection, Krahenbuhl said, the last being at 10 to 9 last night, just hours before the fatal shelling. The attack was also condemned in the strongest possible terms by the normally reticent Secretary-General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon. "Nothing is more shameful than attacking sleeping children," he said. There is no record that the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations choked up as she spoke of infants who perished in the Israeli strike, or in the attack on Gaza altogether. But White House spokesperson Bernadette Meehan did respond. She said that, "We are extremely concerned that thousands of internally displaced Palestinians who have been called on by the Israeli military to evacuate their homes are not safe in UN-designated shelters in Gaza. We also condemn those responsible for hiding weapons in United Nations facilities in Gaza." She omitted to mention that these facilities were empty and that the weapons were found by UNRWA, who had already condemned those who hid them. Later, the administration joined in stronger condemnations of this particular crime, while at the same time releasing more weapons to Israel. In doing so, however, Pentagon spokesman Steve Warren told reporters, "And it's become clear that the Israelis need to do more to live up to their very high standards for protecting civilian life, the high standards it had been exhibiting for many years while using U.S. arms." Attacks on UN compounds sheltering refugees is another Israeli specialty. One famous incident is the Israeli bombardment of the clearly identified UN refugee shelter in Qana during Shimon Peres's murderous Grapes of Wrath campaign in 1996, killing 106 Lebanese civilians who had taken refuge there, including 52 children. To be sure, Israel is not alone in this practice. 20 years earlier, its ally South Africa launched an airborne strike deep into Angola against Kasinga, a refugee camp run by the Namibian resistance SWAPO. Israeli officials laud the humanity of their army, which even goes so far as to inform residents that their homes will be bombed. The practice is sadism, sanctimoniously disguising itself as mercy, in the words of Israeli journalist Amira Hass. A recorded message demanding hundreds of thousands of people leave their already targeted homes, for another place, equally dangerous, 10 kilometers away. In fact, no place in the prison is safe from Israeli sadism. Some find it difficult to profit from Israel's solicitude. An appeal to the world by the Gazan Catholic Church quoted a priest who explained the plight of residents of the House of Christ, a care home dedicated to looking after disabled children. They were removed to the Holy Family Church because Israel was targeting the area, but soon thereafter he wrote, "The Church of Gaza has received an order to evacuate. They will bomb the Tzeitan area and the people are already fleeing." The problem is that the priest Father George and the 3 nuns of Mother Teresa have 29 handicapped children, and 9 old ladies who can't move. How will they manage to leave? If anyone can intercede with someone in power, and pray, please do it. Actually, it shouldn't have been difficult. Israel already provided the instructions at the Al-Wafa Rehabilitation Hospital. And fortunately, at least some states tried to intercede, as best they could. 5 Latin American states, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, El Salvador, and Peru, withdrew their ambassadors from Israel, following the course of Bolivia and Venezuela, which had broken relations in reaction to earlier Israeli crimes. These principled acts were another sign of the remarkable change in world relations as much of Latin America begins to free itself from Western domination, sometimes providing a model of civilized behavior to those who controlled it for 500 years. The hideous revelations elicited a different reaction from the most moral president in the world, the usual one: great sympathy for Israelis, bitter condemnation of Hamas, and calls for moderation on both sides. In his August press conference, President Obama did express concern for Palestinians caught in the crossfire, while again vigorously supporting the right of Israel to defend itself, like everyone. Not quite everyone, not, of course, Palestinians. They have no right to defend themselves, surely not when Israel is on good behavior, keeping to the norm of quiet for quiet, stealing their land, driving them out of their homes, subjecting them to a savage siege, and regularly attacking them with weapons provided by their protector. Palestinians are like black Africans, the Namibian refugees in the Kasinga camp, for example, all terrorists for whom the right of defense does not exist. A 72-hour humanitarian truce was supposed to go into effect at 8 a.m. on August 1. It broke down almost at once. According to a press release of the Al-Mezan Center for Human Rights in Gaza, which has a solid reputation for reliability, one of its field workers in Rafah, at the Egyptian border in the south, heard Israeli artillery firing at about 8:05 a.m. By about 9:30 a.m., after reports that an Israeli soldier had been captured, intensive air and artillery bombing of Rafah was underway, killing probably dozens of people and injuring hundreds who had returned to their homes after the ceasefire entered into effect, though numbers could not be verified. The day before, on July 31, the coastal municipality's water utility, the sole provider of water in the Gaza Strip, had announced that it could no longer provide water or sanitation services because of lack of fuel and frequent attacks on its personnel. The Al-Mezan Center for Human Rights reported that by then, almost all primary health services had stopped in the Gaza Strip due to the lack of water, garbage collection, and environment health services. UNRWA had also warned about the risk of imminent spreading of disease owing to the halt of water and sanitation services. Meanwhile, on the eve of the ceasefire, Israeli missiles fired from aircraft continued to kill and wound victims throughout the region. When the current episode of sadism is finally called off, whenever that will be, Israel hopes to be free to pursue its criminal policies in the occupied territories without interference. Gazans will be free to return to the norm in their Israeli-run prison, while in the West Bank they can watch in peace as Israel dismantles what remains of their possessions. That is the likely outcome if the United States maintains its decisive and virtually unilateral support for Israeli crimes, and its rejection of the long-standing international consensus on diplomatic settlement. But the future would be quite different if the United States withdraws that support. In that case it might be possible to move toward the enduring solution in Gaza that Secretary of State John Kerry called for, eliciting hysterical condemnation in Israel because the phrase could be interpreted as calling for an end to Israel's siege and regular attacks and, horror of horrors, the phrase might even be interpreted as calling for implementation of international law in the rest of the occupied territories. It is not that Israel's security would be threatened by adherence to international law, it would likely be enhanced. But as explained 40 years ago by Israeli General, and later President, Ezer Weizman, Israel could not then exist according to the scale, spirit, and quality she now embodies. There are similar cases in recent history. Indonesian generals swore that they would never abandon what Australian Foreign Minister Gareth Evans called the Indonesian province of East Timor, as he was making a deal to steal Timorese oil. As long as the ruling generals retained U.S. support, through decades of virtually genocidal slaughter, their goals were realistic. Finally, in September 1999, under considerable domestic and international pressure, President Clinton informed them quietly that the game was over and they instantly withdrew from East Timor, while Evans turned to a new career as the lauded apostle of responsibility to protect, in a version designed, of course, to permit a Western resort to violence at will. Another relevant case is South Africa. In 1958, South Africa's foreign minister informed the U.S. ambassador that although his country was becoming a pariah state, it would not matter as long as Washington's support continued. His assessment proved fairly accurate. 30 years later, Ronald Reagan was the last significant holdout in supporting the apartheid regime, which was still sustaining itself. Within a few years, Washington joined the world and the regime collapsed, not for that reason alone, of course. One crucial factor was the remarkable Cuban role in the liberation of Africa, generally ignored in the West, though not in Africa. 40 years ago, Israel made the fateful decision to choose expansion over security, rejecting a full peace treaty offered by Egypt in return for the evacuation of occupied Egyptian Sinai, where Israel was initiating extensive settlement and development projects. It has adhered to that policy ever since, making essentially the same judgment as South Africa did in 1958. In the case of Israel, if the United States decided to join the world, the impact would be far greater. Relations of power allow nothing else, as has been demonstrated whenever Washington has seriously demanded that Israel abandon one of its cherished goals. By now, Israel has little recourse, having adopted policies that turned it from a greatly admired country to one feared and despised, a course it continues to pursue with blind determination in its resolute march toward moral deterioration and possible ultimate destruction. Could U.S. policy change? It's not impossible. Public opinion has shifted considerably in recent years, particularly among the young, and it cannot be completely ignored. For some years, there has been a good basis for public demands that Washington observe its own laws and cut off military aid to Israel. U.S. law requires that no security assistance may be provided to any country the government of which engages in a consistent pattern of gross violations of internationally recognized human rights. Israel most certainly is guilty of such a consistent pattern. That is why Amnesty International, in the course of Operation Cast Lead in Gaza, called for an arms embargo against Israel as well as Hamas. Senator Patrick Leahy, author of this provision of the law, has brought up its potential applicability to Israel in specific cases, and with a well-conducted educational, organizational, and activist effort such initiatives might be pursued successfully. That could have a very significant impact in itself, while also providing a springboard for further actions not only to punish Israel for its criminal behavior, but also to compel Washington to become part of the international community, and observe international law and decent moral principles. Nothing could be more significant for the tragic Palestinian victims of many years of violence and repression. 15. How many minutes to midnight? If some extraterrestrial species were compiling a history of Homo sapiens, they might well break their calendar into two eras, BNW, before nuclear weapons, and NWE, the nuclear weapons era. The latter era, of course, opened on August 6, 1945, the first day of the countdown to what may be the inglorious end of this strange species, which attained the intelligence to discover the effective means to destroy itself, but, so the evidence suggests, not the moral and intellectual capacity to control its own worst instincts. Day 1 of the NWE was marked by the success of Little Boy, a simple atomic bomb. On Day 4, Nagasaki experienced the technological triumph of Fat Man, a more sophisticated design. 5 days later came what the official Air Force history calls the grand finale, a 1,000-plane raid, no mean logistical achievement, on Japan's cities, killing many thousands of people, with leaflets falling among the bombs reading, "Japan has surrendered." President Truman announced that surrender before the last B-29 returned to its base. Those were the auspicious opening days of the NWE. As we now enter its 70th year, we should be contemplating with wonder the fact that we have survived. We can only guess how many years remain. Some reflections on these grim prospects were offered by General Lee Butler, former head of the U.S. Strategic Command, STRATCOM, which controls nuclear weapons and strategy. 20 years ago, Butler wrote that we had so far survived the NWE by some combination of skill, luck, and divine intervention, and I suspect the latter in greatest proportion. Reflecting further on his long career in developing nuclear weapons strategies and organizing the forces to implement them efficiently, he described himself ruefully as having been among the most avid of these keepers of the faith in nuclear weapons. But, he continued, he had come to realize that it was now his burden to declare with all of the conviction I can muster that in my judgment they served us extremely ill. He asked, by what authority do succeeding generations of leaders in the nuclear weapons states usurp the power to dictate the odds of continued life on our planet? Most urgently, why does such breathtaking audacity persist at a moment when we should stand trembling in the face of our folly and united in our commitment to abolish its most deadly manifestations? Butler termed the U.S. Strategic Plan of 1960 that called for an automated all-out strike on the communist world, the single most absurd and irresponsible document I have ever reviewed in my life. Its Soviet counterpart was probably even more insane. But it is important to bear in mind that there are competitors, not least among them the easy acceptance of extraordinary threats to survival. Survival in the early Cold War years. According to received doctrine in scholarship and general intellectual discourse, the prime goal of state policy is national security. There is ample evidence, however, that the doctrine of national security does not encompass the security of the population. The record reveals that, for instance, the threat of instant destruction by nuclear weapons has not ranked high among the concerns of planners. That much was demonstrated early on, and remains true to the present moment. In the early days of the NWE, the United States was overwhelmingly powerful and enjoyed remarkable security. It controlled the hemisphere, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and the opposite sides of those oceans as well. Long before World War II, it had already become by far the richest country in the world, with incomparable advantages. Its economy boomed during the war, while other industrial societies were devastated or severely weakened. By the opening of the new era, the United States possessed about half of total world wealth and an even greater percentage of its manufacturing capacity. There was, however, a potential threat: intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads. That threat was discussed in the standard scholarly study of nuclear policies, carried out with access to high-level sources, danger and survival, choices about the bomb in the first 50 years by McGeorge Bundy, National Security Advisor during the Kennedy and Johnson presidencies. Bundy wrote that, "The timely development of ballistic missiles during the Eisenhower administration is one of the best achievements of those 8 years. Yet it is well to begin with a recognition that both the United States and the Soviet Union might be in much less nuclear danger today if those missiles had never been developed." He then added an instructive comment: "I am aware of no serious contemporary proposal, in or out of either government, that ballistic missiles should somehow be banned by agreement." In short, there was apparently no thought of trying to prevent the sole serious threat to the United States, the threat of utter destruction in a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Could that threat have been taken off the table? We cannot, of course, be sure, but it was hardly inconceivable. The Russians, far behind in industrial development and technological sophistication, were in a far more threatening environment. Hence, they were significantly more vulnerable to such weapons systems than the United States. There might have been opportunities to explore the possibilities of disarmament, but in the extraordinary hysteria of the day they could hardly have even been perceived. And that hysteria was indeed extraordinary. An examination of the rhetoric of central official documents of that moment, like National Security Council paper NSC 68, remains quite shocking. One indication of possible opportunities to blunt the threat was a remarkable proposal by Soviet ruler Joseph Stalin in 1952 offering to allow Germany to be unified with free elections on the condition that it would not then join a hostile military alliance. That was hardly an extreme condition in light of the history of the past half-century, during which Germany alone had practically destroyed Russia twice, exacting a terrible toll. Stalin's proposal was taken seriously by the respected political commentator James Warburg, but otherwise mostly ignored or ridiculed at the time. Recent scholarship has begun to take a different view. The bitterly anti-communist Soviet scholar Adam Ulam has taken the status of Stalin's proposal to be an unresolved mystery. Washington wasted little effort in flatly rejecting Moscow's initiative, he wrote, on grounds that were embarrassingly unconvincing. The political, scholarly, and general intellectual failure left open the basic question, Ulam added. Was Stalin genuinely ready to sacrifice the newly created German Democratic Republic, GDR, on the altar of real democracy, with consequences for world peace and for American security that could have been enormous? Reviewing recent research in Soviet archives, one of the most respected Cold War scholars, Melvin Leffler, observed that many scholars were surprised to discover Lavrentiy Beria, the sinister, brutal head of the Russian secret police, Propos, ed., that the Kremlin offer the West a deal on the unification and neutralization of Germany, agreeing to sacrifice the East German communist regime to reduce East-West tensions and improve internal political and economic conditions in Russia. Opportunities that were squandered in favor of securing German participation in NATO. Under the circumstances, it is not impossible that agreements might have been reached that would have protected the security of the American population from the gravest threat on the horizon. But that possibility apparently was not considered, a striking indication of how slight a role authentic security plays in state policy. The Cuban Missile Crisis and beyond. That conclusion was underscored repeatedly in the years that followed. When Nikita Khrushchev took control in Russia in the years after Stalin's death, he recognized that the USSR could not compete militarily with the United States, the richest and most powerful country in history, with incomparable advantages. If it ever hoped to escape its economic backwardness and the devastating effects of the last World War, the Soviet Union would need to reverse the arms race. Accordingly, Khrushchev proposed sharp mutual reductions in offensive weapons. The incoming Kennedy administration considered the offer and rejected it, instead turning to rapid military expansion, even though it was already far in the lead. The late Kenneth Waltz, supported by other strategic analysts with close connections to U.S. intelligence, wrote then that the Kennedy administration undertook the largest strategic and conventional peacetime military buildup the world has yet seen, even as Khrushchev was trying at once to carry through a major reduction in the conventional forces, and to follow a strategy of minimum deterrence. And we did so even though the balance of strategic weapons greatly favored the United States. Again, the government opted for harming national security while enhancing state power. The Soviet reaction to the U.S. buildup of those years was to place nuclear missiles in Cuba in October 1962 to try to redress the balance at least slightly. The move was also motivated in part by Kennedy's terrorist campaign against Fidel Castro's Cuba, which was scheduled to lead to invasion that very month, as Russia and Cuba may have known. The ensuing missile crisis was the most dangerous moment in history, in the words of historian Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr., Kennedy's advisor and confidant. Of no slight significance is the fact that Kennedy is highly praised for his cool courage and statesmanship in the decisions made at the peak of the crisis, even though he had needlessly placed the population at enormous risk for reasons of state and of personal image. 10 years later, in the last days of the 1973 Israeli-Arab War, Henry Kissinger, then National Security Advisor to President Nixon, called a nuclear alert. The purpose was to warn the Russians not to interfere with his delicate diplomatic maneuvers designed to ensure an Israeli victory, of a limited sort, so that the United States would still be in control of the region unilaterally. And the maneuvers were indeed delicate. The United States and Russia had jointly imposed a ceasefire, but Kissinger secretly informed the Israelis that they could ignore it. Hence the need for the nuclear alert to frighten the Russians away. The security of Americans retained its usual status. 10 years after that, The Reagan administration launched operations to probe Russian air defenses by simulating air and naval attacks, and a high-level nuclear alert that the Russians were intended to detect. These actions were undertaken at a very tense moment. Washington was deploying Pershing II strategic missiles in Europe with a 10-minute flight time to Moscow. President Reagan had also announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, program, which the Russians understood to be effectively a first-strike weapon, a standard interpretation of missile defense on all sides. And other tensions were rising. Naturally, these actions caused great alarm in Russia, which unlike the United States was quite vulnerable and had repeatedly been invaded and virtually destroyed. That led to a major war scare in 1983. Newly released archives reveal that the danger was even more severe than historians had previously assumed. A high-level U.S. intelligence study entitled "The War Scare Was for Real" concluded that U.S. intelligence may have underestimated Russian concerns and the threat of a Russian preventative nuclear strike. The exercises almost became a prelude to a preventative nuclear strike, according to an account in the Journal of Strategic Studies. It was even more dangerous than that, as we learned in the fall of 2013, when the BBC reported that right in the midst of these world-threatening developments, Russia's early warning systems detected an incoming missile strike from the United States, sending its nuclear system onto the highest level alert. The protocol for the Soviet military was to retaliate with a nuclear attack of its own. Fortunately, the officer on duty, Stanislav Petrov, decided to disobey orders and not report the warnings to his superiors. He received an official reprimand. And thanks to his dereliction of duty, we're still alive to talk about it. The security of the population was no more a high priority for Reagan administration planners than for their predecessors. And so it continues to the present, even putting aside the numerous near-catastrophic nuclear accidents that have occurred over the years, many reviewed in Eric Schlosser's chilling study Command and Control. In other words, it is hard to contest General Butler's conclusions. Survival in the post-Cold War era. The record of post-Cold War actions and doctrines is hardly reassuring either. Every self-respecting president has to have a doctrine. The Clinton doctrine was encapsulated in the slogan, multilateral when we can, unilateral when we must. In congressional testimony, the phrase, when we must, was explained more fully. The United States is entitled to resort to the unilateral use of military power to ensure uninhibited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources. Meanwhile, Stratcom in the Clinton era produced an important study entitled Essentials of Post-Cold War Deterrence, issued well after the Soviet Union had collapsed and Clinton was extending President George H.W. Bush's program of expanding NATO to the east in violation of verbal promises to Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev, with reverberations to the present. That study was concerned with the role of nuclear weapons in the post-Cold War era. A central conclusion, that the United States must maintain the right to launch a first strike, even against non-nuclear states. Furthermore, nuclear weapons must always be at the ready because they cast a shadow over any crisis or conflict. They were, that is, constantly being used, just as you're using a gun if you aim but don't fire one while robbing a store, a point that Daniel Ellsberg has repeatedly stressed. Stratcom went on to advise that planners should not be too rational about determining what the opponent values the most. Anything is a possible target. It hurts to portray ourselves as too fully rational and cool-headed. That the U.S. may become irrational and vindictive if its vital interests are attacked should be a part of the national persona. we project. It is beneficial for our strategic posture if some elements may appear to be potentially out of control, thus posing a constant threat of nuclear attack, a severe violation of the UN Charter, if anyone cares. Not much here about the noble goals constantly proclaimed, or, for that matter, the obligation under the Non-Proliferation Treaty to make good faith efforts to eliminate this scourge of the earth. What resounds, rather, is an adaptation of Hilaire Belloc's famous couplet about the Maxim gun, to quote the great African historian Chinwezu. Whatever happens, we have got the atom bomb, and they have not. After Clinton came, of course, George W. Bush, whose broad endorsement of preventive war easily encompasses Japan's attack in December 1941 on military bases in 2 U.S. overseas possessions, at a time when Japanese militarists were well aware that B-17 flying fortresses were being rushed off assembly lines and deployed to those bases with the intent to burn out the industrial heart of the empire with firebomb attacks on the teeming bamboo ant heaps of Honshu and Kyushu. That was how the pre-war plans were described by their architect, Air Force General Claire Chennault, with the enthusiastic approval of President Franklin Roosevelt, Secretary of State Cordell Hull, and Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall. Then came Barack Obama, with pleasant words about working to abolish nuclear weapons, combined with plans to spend $1 trillion on the U.S. nuclear arsenal over the next 30 years, a percentage of the military budget, comparable to spending for procurement of new strategic systems in the 1980s under President Ronald Reagan. According to a study by the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. Obama has also not hesitated to play with fire for political gain. Take for example the capture and assassination of Osama bin Laden by Navy SEALs. Obama brought it up with pride in an important speech on national security in May 2013. The speech was widely covered, but one crucial paragraph was ignored. Obama hailed the operation but added that it could not be the norm. The reason, he said, was that the risks were immense. The SEALs might have been embroiled in an extended firefight. Even though, by luck, that didn't happen. The cost to our relationship with Pakistan and the backlash among the Pakistani public over encroachment on their territory was severe. Let us now add a few details. The SEALs were ordered to fight their way out if apprehended. They would not have been left to their fate if, embroiled in an extended firefight, the full force of the U.S. military would have been used to extricate them. Pakistan has a powerful, well-trained military, highly protective of state sovereignty. It also has nuclear weapons, and Pakistani specialists are concerned about the possible penetration of their nuclear security system by jihadi elements. It is also no secret that the population has been embittered and radicalized by Washington's drone terror campaign and other policies. While the SEALs were still in the bin Laden compound, Pakistani Chief of Staff Ashfaq Parvez Kayani was informed of the raid and ordered the military to confront any unidentified aircraft, which he assumed would be from India. Meanwhile, in Kabul, U.S. War Commander General David Petraeus ordered warplanes to respond if the Pakistanis scrambled their fighter jets. As Obama said, by luck the worst didn't happen, though it could have been quite ugly. But the risks were faced without noticeable concern or subsequent comment. As General Butler observed, it is a near miracle that we have escaped destruction so far, and the longer we tempt fate, the less likely it is that we can hope for divine intervention to perpetuate the miracle. 16. Ceasefires in which violations never cease. On August 26, 2014, Israel and the Palestinian Authority, PA. Both accepted a ceasefire agreement after a 50-day Israeli assault on Gaza that left 2,100 Palestinians dead and vast landscapes of destruction behind. The agreement called for an end to military action by both Israel and Hamas, as well as an easing of the Israeli siege that had strangled Gaza for many years. This was, however, just the most recent in a series of ceasefire agreements reached after each of Israel's periodic escalations of its unremitting assault on Gaza. Throughout this period, the terms of these agreements remained essentially the same. The regular pattern has been for Israel to then disregard whatever agreement is in place, while Hamas observes it until a sharp increase in Israeli violence elicits a Hamas response, which is followed by even fiercer Israeli brutality. These escalations are often called mowing the lawn in Israeli parlance, though the 2014 Israeli operation was more accurately described by an appalled senior U.S. military officer as removing the topsoil. The first of this series of truces was the Agreement on Movement and Access between Israel and the Palestinian Authority in November 2005. It called for the opening of a crossing between Gaza and Egypt at Rafah for the export of goods and the transit of people, the continuous operation of crossings between Israel and Gaza for the import, export of goods and the transit of people, the reduction of obstacles to movement within the West Bank, bus and truck convoys between the West Bank and Gaza, the building of a seaport in Gaza, and the reopening of the airport in Gaza that Israeli bombing had demolished. That agreement was reached shortly after Israel withdrew its settlers and military forces from Gaza. The motive for the withdrawal was explained with engaging cynicism by Dov Weissglass, a confidant of then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who was in charge of negotiating and implementing it. Summarizing the purpose of the operation, Weissglass explained that the disengagement is actually formaldehyde. It supplies the amount of formaldehyde that is necessary so there will not be a political process with the Palestinians. In the background, Israeli hawks recognized that instead of investing substantial resources in maintaining a few thousand settlers in illegal subsidized communities in devastated Gaza, it made more sense to transfer them to illegal subsidized communities in areas of the West Bank that Israel intended to keep. The disengagement was depicted as a noble effort to pursue peace, but the reality was quite different. Israel never relinquished control of Gaza and is accordingly recognized as the occupying power by the United Nations, the United States, and other states, apart from Israel itself, of course. In their comprehensive history of settlement in the occupied territories, Israeli scholars Edith Zertel and Akiva Eldar describe what actually happened when that country disengaged. The ruined territory was not released for even a single day from Israel's military grip or from the price of the occupation that the inhabitants pay every day. After the disengagement, Israel left behind scorched earth, devastated services, and people with neither a present nor a future. The settlements were destroyed in an ungenerous move by an unenlightened occupier, which in fact continues to control the territory and kill and harass its inhabitants by means of its formidable military might. Operations Cast Lead and Pillar of Defense. Israel soon had a pretext for violating the November Agreement more severely. In January 2006, the Palestinians committed a serious crime. They voted the wrong way in carefully monitored free elections, placing the parliament in the hands of Hamas. Israel and the United States immediately imposed harsh sanctions, telling the world very clearly what they mean by democracy promotion, and soon began planning a military coup to overthrow the unacceptable elected government, a familiar procedure. When Hamas preempted the coup in 2007, the siege of Gaza grew far more severe. and regular Israeli military attacks commenced. Voting the wrong way in a free election was bad enough, but preempting a U.S.-planned military coup proved to be an unpardonable offense. A new ceasefire agreement was reached in June 2008. It again called for opening the border crossings to allow the transfer of all goods that were banned and restricted to go into Gaza. Israel formally agreed, but immediately announced that it would not abide by the agreement until Hamas released Gilad Shalit, an Israeli soldier it held. Israel itself has a long history of kidnapping civilians in Lebanon and on the high seas and holding them for lengthy periods, without credible charges, sometimes as hostages. Imprisoning civilians on dubious charges, or none at all, is also a regular practice in the territories Israel controls. Israel not only maintained the siege in violation of the 2008 ceasefire agreement but did so with extreme rigor, even preventing the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which cares for the huge number of official refugees in Gaza, from replenishing its stocks. On November 4, while the media were focused on the U.S. presidential election, Israeli troops entered Gaza and killed half a dozen Hamas militants. That elicited a Hamas missile response and an exchange of fire. All the deaths were Palestinian. In late December, Hamas offered to renew the ceasefire. Israel considered the offer, but rejected it, preferring instead to launch Operation Cast Lead, a 3-week incursion with the full power of the Israeli military into the Gaza Strip, resulting in atrocities well documented by international and Israeli human rights organizations. On January 8, 2009, while Cast Lead was in full fury, the UN Security Council passed a unanimous resolution, with the United States abstaining, calling for an immediate ceasefire leading to a full Israeli withdrawal, unimpeded provision through Gaza of food, fuel, and medical treatment, and intensified international arrangements to prevent arms and ammunition smuggling. A new ceasefire agreement was indeed reached, similar to the previous ones, but again was never really observed and broke down completely with the next major mowing the lawn episode, Operation Pillar of Defense, in November 2012. What happened in the interim can be illustrated by the casualty figures from January 2012 to the launching of that operation. 1 Israeli killed by fire from Gaza, 78 Palestinians killed by Israeli fire. The first act of Operation Pillar of Defense was the murder of Ahmed Jabari, a high official of the military wing of Hamas. Aluf Ben, editor-in-chief of Israel's leading newspaper, Haaretz, described Jabari as Israel's subcontractor in Gaza, who enforced relative quiet there for more than 5 years. As always, there was a pretext for the assassination, but the likely reason was provided by Israeli peace activist Gershon Baskin. He had been involved in direct negotiations with Jabari for years and reported that, hours before he was assassinated, Jabari received the draft of a permanent truce agreement with Israel, which included mechanisms for maintaining the ceasefire in the case of a flare-up between Israel and the factions in the Gaza Strip. There is a long record of Israeli actions designed to deter the threat of a diplomatic settlement. After this exercise in mowing the lawn, a ceasefire agreement was reached yet again. Repeating the now standard terms, it called for a cessation of military action by both sides and the effective ending of the siege of Gaza with Israel, opening the crossings and facilitating the movements of people and transfer of goods, and refraining from restricting residents' free movements and targeting residents in border areas. What happened next was reviewed by Nathan Thrall, senior Middle East analyst for the International Crisis Group. Israeli intelligence recognized that Hamas was observing the terms of the ceasefire. Israel, Thrall wrote, therefore saw little incentive in upholding its end of the deal. In the 3 months following the ceasefire, its forces made regular incursions into Gaza, strafed Palestinian farmers and those collecting scrap and rubble across the border, and fired at boats, preventing fishermen from accessing the majority of Gaza's waters. In other words, the siege never ended. Crossings were repeatedly shut. So-called buffer zones inside Gaza, from which Palestinians are barred, and which include a third or more of the Strip's limited arable land, were reinstated. Imports declined, exports were blocked, and fewer Gazans were given exit permits to Israel and the West Bank. Operation Protective Edge. So matters continued until April 2014, when an important event took place. The two major Palestinian groupings, Gaza-based Hamas and the Fatah-dominated Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, signed a unity agreement. Hamas made major concessions. The unity government contained none of its members or allies. In substantial measure, as Thrall observes, Hamas turned over governance of Gaza to the PA. Several thousand PA security forces were sent there, and the PA placed its guards at borders and crossings, with no reciprocal positions for Hamas in the West Bank security apparatus. Finally, the unity government accepted the 3 conditions that Washington and the European Union had long demanded: non-violence, adherence to past agreements, and the recognition of Israel. Israel was infuriated. Its government declared at once that it would refuse to deal with the unity government and cancelled negotiations. Its fury mounted when the United States, along with most of the world, signaled support for the unity government. There are good reasons why Israel opposes the unification of Palestinians. One is that the Hamas-Fatah conflict has provided a useful pretext for refusing to engage in serious negotiations. How can one negotiate with a divided entity? More significantly, for more than 20 years, Israel has been committed to separating Gaza from the West Bank, in violation of the Oslo Accords, which declare Gaza and the West Bank to be an inseparable territorial unity. A look at a map explains the rationale. Separated from Gaza, any West Bank enclaves left to Palestinians have no access to the outside world. Furthermore, Israel has been systematically taking over the Jordan Valley, driving out Palestinians, establishing settlements, sinking wells, and otherwise ensuring that the region, about 1/3 of the West Bank, including much of its arable land, will ultimately be integrated into Israel along with the other regions that Israel is taking over. Hence remaining Palestinian cantons will be completely imprisoned. Unification with Gaza would interfere with these plans, which trace back to the early days of the occupation and have had steady support from the major political blocs, including from figures usually portrayed as doves, like former President Shimon Peres, one of the architects of settlement deep in the West Bank. As usual, a pretext was needed to move on to the next escalation. Such an occasion arose with the brutal murder of 3 Israeli boys from the settler community in the West Bank. An 18-day rampage primarily targeting Hamas followed. On September 2, Haaretz reported that, after intensive interrogations, the Israeli security services concluded the abduction of the teenagers was carried out by an independent cell, with no known direct links to Hamas. By then, the 18-day rampage had succeeded in undermining the feared unity government. Hamas finally reacted with its first rockets in 18 months. Providing Israel with the pretext to launch Operation Protective Edge on July 8. That 50-day assault proved the most extreme exercise in mowing the lawn, so far. Operations still to be named. Israel is in a fine position today to reverse its decades-old policy of separating Gaza from the West Bank, and observe a major ceasefire agreement for the first time. At least temporarily, the threat of democracy in neighboring Egypt has been diminished, and the brutal Egyptian military dictatorship of General Abdul Fattah al-Sisi is a welcome ally for Israel in maintaining control over Gaza. With the Palestinian Unity Government placing U.S.-trained forces of the Palestinian Authority in control of Gaza's borders, and governance possibly shifting into the hands of the PA, which depends on Israel for its survival as well as for its finances, Israel might feel that there is little to fear from some limited form of autonomy for the enclaves that remain to Palestinians. There is also some truth to the observation of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Many elements in the region understand today that, in the struggle in which they are threatened, Israel is not an enemy but a partner. Akiva Eldar, Israel's leading diplomatic correspondent, adds, however, that all those many elements in the region also understand that there is no brave and comprehensive diplomatic move on the horizon without an agreement on the establishment of a Palestinian state, based on the 1967 borders and a just, agreed-upon solution to the refugee problem. That is not on Israel's agenda, he points out. Some knowledgeable Israeli commentators, notably columnist Danny Rubenstein, believe that Israel is poised to reverse course and relax its stranglehold on Gaza. We'll see. The record of these past years suggests otherwise, and the first signs are not auspicious. As Operation Protective Edge ended, Israel announced its largest appropriation of West Bank land in 30 years, almost 1,000 acres. Israel Radio reported that the takeover was in response to the killing of the 3 Jewish teenagers by Hamas militants. A Palestinian boy was burned to death in retaliation for the murders, but no Israeli land was handed over to the Palestinians, nor was there any reaction when an Israeli soldier murdered 10-year-old Khalil Anadi on a quiet street in a refugee camp near Hebron and then drove away in his jeep as the child bled to death. Anadi was one of the 23 Palestinians, including 3 children, killed by Israeli occupation forces in the West Bank during the Gaza onslaught, according to UN statistics, along with more than 2,000 wounded, 38% by live fire. None of those killed were endangering soldiers' lives, Israeli journalist Gideon Levy reported. To none of this is there any reaction, just as there was no reaction while Israel killed, on average, more than 2 Palestinian children a week for the past 14 years. They are unpeople, after all. It is commonly claimed on all sides that, if the two-state settlement is dead as a result of Israel's takeover of Palestinian lands, then the outcome will be one state west of the Jordan River. Some Palestinians welcome this outcome, anticipating that they can then conduct a civil rights struggle for equal rights on the model of South Africa under apartheid. Many Israeli commentators warn that the resulting demographic problem of more Arab than Jewish births and diminishing Jewish immigration will undermine their hope for a democratic Jewish state. But these widespread beliefs are dubious. The realistic alternative to a two-state settlement is that Israel will continue to carry forward the plans it has been implementing for years, taking over whatever is of value to it in the West Bank, while avoiding Palestinian population concentrations and removing Palestinians from the areas it is integrating into Israel. That should preempt the dreaded demographic problem. These basic policies have been underway since the 1967 conquest, following a principle enunciated by then Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, one of the Israeli leaders most sympathetic to the Palestinians. He informed his party colleagues that they should tell Palestinian refugees in the West Bank, "We have no solution. You shall continue to live like dogs, and whoever wishes may leave, and we will see where this process leads." The suggestion was natural within the overriding conception articulated in 1972 by future President Chaim Herzog. I do not deny the Palestinians a place or stand or opinion on every matter. But certainly I am not prepared to consider them as partners in any respect in a land that has been consecrated, in the hands of our nation for thousands of years. For the Jews of this land there cannot be any partner. Dayan also called for Israel's permanent rule, Memshalat Kiva, over the occupied territories. When Netanyahu expresses the same stand today, he is not breaking new ground. For a century, the Zionist colonization of Palestine has proceeded primarily on the pragmatic principle of the quiet establishment of facts on the ground, which the world was to ultimately come to accept. It has been a highly successful policy. There is every reason to expect it to persist as long as the United States provides the necessary military, economic, diplomatic, and ideological support. For those concerned with the rights of the brutalized Palestinians, there can be no higher priority than working to change U.S. policies. Not an idle dream by any means.